911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice crackled through the speaker as Karen's shrill voice blasted over the line. Yes. I need the police immediately. There are intruders on my private lake. A group of trespassers, children, no less, running wild like hooligans. I feel threatened. Send officers now. Her voice carried the kind of manufactured panic that only came from someone who had way too much time and entitlement on their hand. I was standing there, knee-deep in the cool lake water, watching my kids laugh as they splashed around with our dog, Buddy, a golden retriever whose only crime was existing too happily. My son, Max, was expertly skipping stones across the surface, while Lily, my youngest, was building some kind of muddy castle along the shore. It was a perfect day, until the Queen of Chaos herself showed up, arms crossed, sunglasses perched on her forehead like she was about to give a TED talk on property law. Excuse me. Excuse me. Karen's voice cut through the air like nails on a chalkboard. You are trespassing. This is private property. She pointed an accusatory finger at my children as if they were criminals caught mid-bank heist. I sighed, adjusting my sunglasses as I waded toward her. Karen, I said, my voice carrying the kind of calm that I knew would drive her even crazier. We own this land. My family has owned it for over 3 generations. No, you are mistaken, she snapped, her face turning a shade of red that was almost impressive. I have lived here for 10 years, and I know for a fact that this lake is part of my property. Buddy, sensing the tension, let out a happy bark and ran up to Karen, tail wagging. Karen reacted as if he had just lunged at her with fangs bared. Control your beast. I'll have animal control out here in an instant. Max looked up from his stone skipping, wiping mud from his hands. Lady, you're crazy. Lily, still fully committed to her mud construction, offered Karen a clump of damp dirt with a big grin. You need to relax. Here, play with this. Karen let out a strangled gasp, jerking back as if my daughter had handed her live explosive. That is disgusting. This is why children need proper supervision. No respect for rules. No sense of boundaries. I was about to explain, once again, that she was wildly incorrect, when she suddenly whipped out her phone and started dialing. I groaned internally. Ma'am, please state your emergency, the 911 operator said over the speaker. I just did. There are people illegally occupying my property. I want them removed immediately. I crossed my arms and gave her an amused look. Karen, seriously? She ignored me. I demand that an officer be sent at once. This is a threat to my personal safety. At that, I laughed. A couple of kids and a dog are a threat to your safety? Wow, Karen, I didn't realize we were dealing with hardened criminals. She glared at me with the intensity of someone who had been waiting their whole life to unleash their inner HOA dictator. You'll see. The police will sort this out. 10 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up and out stepped Officer Daniels, a veteran cop who had likely been dealing with Karen's nonsense for years. His eyes scanned the scene, landing on me, my kids, and a very happy Buddy wagging his tail. Then he turned to Karen, who stood like an avenging angel of justice, arms folded, tapping her foot impatiently. Ma'am, what's the issue? Daniels asked, clearly tired before the conversation even started. Karen immediately launched into her dramatic monologue. These people are trespassing on my private lake. I told them to leave and they refused. This is criminal behavior, and I demand action. Daniels turned to me, eyebrow raised. Jake, what's going on here? I pulled out my phone and opened up the official property record. Actually, officer, my family owns this land. Has for 3 generations. She's the one making a scene. Daniels took one look at the documents, sighed, and turned back to Karen. Ma'am, it says right here that the Thompsons own this property. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. That can't be right. That's a mistake. This is My Lake. Daniels pinched the bridge of his nose. Ma'am, do you have any documents to prove ownership? Karen's eyes darted around. Well, no. But I don't need proof. I've lived here for 10 years. Daniels looked at her like she had just suggested the earth was flat. Ma'am, that's not how property ownership works. Karen, still unwilling to accept defeat, huffed dramatically. This is outrageous. You're just going to let these people stay? On MY Lake. Daniels, clearly done with this conversation, turned to me. Jake, you good here? Better than ever, I said with a grin. Karen let out an incoherent scream of frustration and stormed off, but not before pointing a finger at me. This isn't over. I will be taking legal action. Daniels muttered under his breath as he walked back to his cruiser. Lord help me. I watched Karen stomp away, muttering about talking to the city council as if she had any real power. The kids, unfazed by the entire ordeal, went back to playing in the water. Buddy trotted up to me and flopped into the sand, tongue lolling happily. Max skipped another stone. Hey Dad. Yeah. That lady is totally nuts. I laughed. Yep. And something tells me this isn't the last we'll see of her. As Karen disappeared behind the trees, I had no idea just how right I was. This was only the beginning. The next morning, I stepped outside to grab the newspaper and was greeted with something far more interesting. A thick, official-looking envelope was taped to my mailbox, the words, Urgent HOA Violation Notice, stamped in bold red ink across the front. I frowned, knowing full well that we weren't part of an HOA. In fact, no one on this side of the lake was. Tearing it open, I skimmed through the absurd letter inside. According to this so-called homeowners association, I was in violation of multiple community rules, including unauthorized use of lake property, excessive noise pollution from minors, and the particularly amusing failure to comply with neighborhood aesthetic standards. At the bottom, in hilariously official-looking print, was the name of the HOA president, Karen Mitchell. I let out a slow, amused sigh. Of course. Walking back inside, I held up the letter as my wife, Emily, sipped her coffee. She took one look and snorted. She actually thinks she runs an HOA? That's next-level delusion. I flopped onto the couch, waving the letter. Apparently, our kids playing at the lake is a violation of her imaginary government. Max and Lily, who had been watching cartoons, perked up. Are we in trouble? Max asked, only half concerned. I grinned. No, buddy. But Karen is about to be. A quick neighborhood group chat confirmed my suspicions. Karen had been pulling this stunt for years, acting like she had authority over people's property. Most folks ignored her, but she had managed to bully a few into complying just to avoid the headache. One neighbor, Mr. Reynolds, an elderly man who had lived in the area for decades, revealed that she had once fined him $100 for unsightly garden gnomes. Another neighbor, Sarah, said Karen had threatened to report her to some non-existent HOA board for having an inflatable pool in her backyard. The best story came from Greg, a guy who had nearly gone to war with Karen over his Christmas light. She actually wrote me a citation for light pollution and tried to make me take them down. I just kept adding more. By December 24th, my house was visible from space. That's when the idea hit. If Karen wanted to play HOA dictator, it was time to give her a taste of her own medicine. That evening, with the help of a few very enthusiastic neighbors, we created the ultimate prank, a fake HOA violation spree, except this time, every single citation was directed at Karen herself. At dawn, a small group of us snuck onto her property and carefully placed official-looking notices all over her front yard, mailbox, and even taped one to her front door. Some of the violations included excessive unauthorized gossiping, fined $250, illegal use of binoculars for nosiness, cease and desist immediately, and my personal favorite, high-level Karen activity, immediate intervention required. By noon, we gathered in small groups, watching from a distance as Karen stormed out of her house, eyes wide with fury. She spun around in circles, ripping down the notices one by one, screeching like a banshee. What is this? Who did this? This is vandalism. She clutched the papers in her fists, waving them like evidence in a courtroom. This is slander. I'm calling the police. She stomped her foot so hard her sandal went flying, which only added to the spectacle. A few neighbors stifled laughter as she ranted at the sky, demanding justice from the universe itself. She stormed back inside, probably to call every local authority she could think of. Sure enough, an hour later, Officer Daniels pulled up again, looking even more exhausted than last time. Karen practically dragged him onto her lawn, shoving the papers in his face. "Officer, this is a targeted attack. I am being harassed. Someone is impersonating an HOA authority and trying to find me on my own property." Daniels took one glance at the papers, sighed heavily, and rubbed his temples. "Karen, these aren't real." Her face turned redder. "I know that. But someone is mocking me. This is a personal attack. And I demand that you do something about it." Daniels looked around, seeing half the neighborhood casually observing with amused grins. He let out a long breath, clearly choosing his words carefully. "Karen, I can't arrest someone for a prank." Karen's jaw dropped. "A prank? This is targeted harassment." Daniels tilted his head. "You mean like sending fake HOA violations to people who don't even belong to an HOA?" Karen went completely still. A flicker of something, guilt, maybe, crossed her face, but it vanished almost immediately, replaced with a fresh wave of indignation. "That is not the same thing. I am trying to enforce community standards." Daniels gave her a long, knowing look before shaking his head. "Karen, stop creating problems where there aren't any." With that, he walked back to his cruiser, and Karen stood frozen, sputtering in outrage. The moment he left, she turned toward us, eyes blazing. "This isn't over," she shrieked. "I will find out who did this. And when I do," she didn't finish her threat because Buddy, our overly friendly dog, chose that moment to run up to her and jump, leaving a perfect set of muddy paw prints all over her pristine white pants. The neighborhood collectively lost it. As she stomped back inside, covered in mud, her phone clenched in a death grip, I knew she was already plotting her next move. And if I knew anything about Karen, it was going to be big. But what she didn't realize was that she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. The letter arrived 2 days later, a thick envelope stuffed into my mailbox like it had been jammed in with the force of pure rage. The return address wasn't from any official government office, but from some rinky-dink legal firm that I had never heard of. That alone told me everything I needed to know. Still, I opened it with curiosity, expecting something ridiculous, and Karen did not disappoint. The moment I unfolded the pages, I was greeted with a long-winded, completely absurd lawsuit claiming that I had repeatedly and maliciously violated homeowners association regulations, caused her emotional distress, and, my personal favorite, stolen her lakefront experience. There was an entire section where she detailed how my children had sabotaged her peace by engaging in excessive water disruption, which, translated from Karen's speak, meant splashing around and having fun like normal kid. It would have been hilarious if it wasn't so pathetic. Emily read over my shoulder, shaking her head in disbelief. "She actually paid a lawyer to write this?" she asked, her voice caught between laughter and amazement. I flipped to the last page, where the firm's name was scrawled in ink, Percy Wiggins and Associates. I had no idea who Percy Wiggins was, but I had a strong suspicion that his firm probably operated out of a strip mall next to a payday loan office. This was next-level Karen behavior. She had gone from petty threats to full-blown legal action, all because she couldn't handle the fact that she didn't own the lake. It was almost impressive. Almost. Instead of being angry, I was entertained. If she wanted to play this game, I would gladly take her on. I picked up my phone, dialed my old friend, Mark, who happened to be a real estate attorney, and read him the lawsuit word for word. He didn't even let me finish before he burst out laughing. "She actually wrote that? In a legal document?" I could practically hear him wiping away tears. Jake, she's suing you for stealing her lakefront experience? That's not even a thing. Oh, it gets better, I said, flipping a page. She claims that my dog willfully engaged in property damage by tracking mud onto her lawn. Mark wheezed. Buddy's a criminal mastermind now? Apparently. Mark calmed down enough to tell me exactly what I already knew. This lawsuit was nonsense. She has no case. She's wasting her money. But you know what? Let's have some fun with it. I'll draft a response. 2 weeks later, the court date arrived, and I walked into the small-town courtroom dressed in my most professional-looking button-down, ready for the show. Karen sat across from me, her expression smug, as if she had already won. She had even come dressed in her version of court attire, which involved an aggressively shoulder-padded blazer and a pearl necklace that screamed, "I demand to speak to the manager." Next to her sat the infamous Percy Wiggins, who was exactly what I had pictured, a greasy, nervous-looking man in an ill-fitting suit that seemed to be at least 2 decades out of fashion. He shuffled through a pile of papers, sweating profusely, while Karen whispered furiously into his ear. The judge, a no-nonsense woman who had probably dealt with more ridiculous cases than she cared to admit, took her seat and sighed heavily before asking Karen's lawyer to present the case. Percy, still sweating, stood up and cleared his throat dramatically. "Your Honor, my client has been a victim of persistent harassment, property violations, and targeted disruption of her quality of life." The judge held up a hand. "Sir, let's start with the basics. What, exactly, are you claiming the defendant did?" Percy fumbled with his papers. "Well, Your Honor, Mr. Thompson has repeatedly trespassed on my client's property." Objection. Mark, sitting beside me, didn't even look up from his note. "My client owns the land in question. Here are the official property deeds." The judge took the documents, glanced at them, then turned to Karen. "Ma'am, you don't own the lake. Mr. Thompson does." Karen's face twitched. That's incorrect." The judge looked unimpressed. "Are you claiming the county records are wrong?" Karen opened her mouth, then shut it again. I could see the gears grinding in her head, trying to come up with some kind of argument that didn't immediately make her look like an idiot. Meanwhile, Percy was sweating bullets, clearly regretting every life choice that had led him to represent this woman. Then came the twist that no one saw coming. As the judge skimmed the documents, she frowned slightly, flipping back a page. "Hold on a moment," she said, reading carefully. "There seems to be a boundary discrepancy here. According to these records, ma'am, your property line actually cuts off several feet shorter than you've been claiming." Karen blinked. "Excuse me?" The judge looked up at her. "It appears that part of what you've considered your property, including a portion of your backyard, is actually within Mr. Thompson's legal land ownership." Silence. The courtroom was dead quiet as Karen processed the fact that, not only had she lost the case, but she had essentially just walked into a courtroom and confirmed that she had been the real trespasser all along. Mark let out a low whistle beside me. "Wow. That's embarrassing." Karen, realizing she was now in real legal trouble, shot up from her chair. "That's a mistake. I demand a recount." The judge pinched the bridge of her nose. "Ma'am, this is not an election. You can't recount property records." Percy Wiggins, sensing that this was a lost cause, quickly began gathering his papers, clearly eager to get as far away from Karen as possible. Meanwhile, I just sat there, arms crossed, enjoying every second of watching her self-destruct. The judge banged her gavel. "Case dismissed. Mr. Thompson, you are free to go. Ms. Mitchell, I suggest you review your property boundaries before filing any more claims." Karen let out an incoherent noise of rage as I stood up, giving her a polite smile before walking out. As I stepped outside into the fresh air, I took a deep breath, feeling the sweet, satisfying taste of victory. I had a feeling Karen wasn't done yet, but after today, she was out of weapons. The best part? She had just given me the ultimate trump card. If she ever so much as breathed in my direction again, I now had legal grounds to make her life very, very uncomfortable. And knowing Karen, that reality was going to drive her absolutely insane. A week passed, and for the first time in a while, things were quiet. Too quiet. Karen hadn't been seen stomping around the neighborhood, there were no more fake HOA notices appearing in mailboxes, and she hadn't tried to send the police after us again. That should have been a relief, but deep down, I knew better. Karen didn't just accept defeat. She was like a raccoon digging through a trash can, persistent, irrational, and incapable of understanding when to stop. So when I got a letter in the mail that looked suspiciously like official county paperwork, I knew exactly who was behind it before I even opened it. Inside was a notice claiming that my lakefront property was now under review for improper land development, and that I was required to cease all recreational use of the lake until further notice. There was even a threat of fines if I didn't comply. It would have been alarming if it weren't so blatantly fake. The formatting was all wrong, the wording was weirdly aggressive, and, most importantly, it was signed by someone named Deputy Land Officer K. Mitchell. Karen had officially upgraded from fake HOA president to fake government official. Emily took one look at the letter and burst out laughing. "She's not even trying to be subtle anymore, is she?" I smirked, shaking my head. "Nope. She went full cartoon villain." I considered my options. I could ignore it, but where was the fun in that? Instead, I decided to take the pettiness up a notch. I pulled out my laptop, drafted an equally ridiculous response, and printed it on fancy-looking stationery. The letter, written in the most official legal jargon I could muster, stated that her complaint had been reviewed and found to be in violation of the Neighborhood Nuisance Act, subsection Serial Complainer Clause. It concluded that her actions had resulted in a permanent restriction on her ability to issue complaints, effective immediately. I even added a fake government seal just for fun. That evening, I slipped the letter into her mailbox and waited. The next morning, Karen stormed out of her house, holding the letter like it was a live grenade. She whipped out her phone, pacing furiously. A few minutes later, a familiar police cruiser rolled up, and out stepped Officer Daniels, looking about as thrilled as someone called into work on their day off. Karen ran up to him, waving the letter like it was proof of a national conspiracy. "This is illegal. I demand to know who authorized this." Daniels took the paper, skimmed it, and let out the deepest, most exhausted sigh I had ever heard. Then, without a word, he turned and walked up my driveway. I was already leaning against the porch railing, coffee in hand, watching the show. He stopped at the steps, holding up the letter. "Jake? Daniels? Did you send this?" "I have no idea what you're talking about," I said, taking a slow sip of coffee. He squinted at me. "This letter says she's banned from issuing complaints under the Serial Complainer Clause." "Sounds official," I said casually. He sighed again, rubbing his temples. "You know I should tell you not to antagonize her, right?" I shrugged. "Tell her to stop harassing my family and maybe I'll consider it." He muttered something under his breath, then turned back to Karen. "Ma'am, this isn't a real legal document." Karen's face twisted. "Then arrest him. He's falsifying government orders." Daniels just stared at her. "Ma'am, you literally just sent him a fake legal notice claiming his land was under investigation." Karen sputtered. "That's different." "That was fraud," he interrupted. "And if you don't stop this nonsense, I'm going to start treating it like an actual crime." Her mouth snapped shut. "Now," Daniels continued, "I strongly suggest you leave the Thompsons alone before you find yourself in real trouble." He handed her back the letter, and walked back to his cruiser without another word. Karen stood frozen, rage simmering beneath her stiff expression. Then, with a dramatic huff, she stomped back inside, slamming the door behind her so hard that a decorative wreath fell off and rolled down the porch step. The neighborhood let out a collective sigh of relief over the next few days. It seemed, at long last, that Karen had been defeated. But the best part was yet to come. A few weeks later, a real estate sign appeared in her yard. She was selling her house. The realization spread like wildfire, and soon, neighbors were gathering in driveways, whispering excitedly. Greg, the Christmas lights guy, was practically glowing. "I thought this day would never come," he said, watching as Karen barked orders at a moving crew. I grinned. "I'm almost gonna miss her. It's been entertaining." "Almost," Emily added. As we stood there, watching Karen's reign of terror finally come to an end, Max and Lily ran up, giggling. "What's happening?" Max asked. "She's leaving," I told him. "For good." Lily's eyes widened. I nodded. They both looked at each other, then at Buddy, who wagged his tail. Without another word, they ran toward the lake, whooping in celebration. A week later, she was gone, and for the first time in a long time, the neighborhood felt peaceful. No more fake violations, no more HOA scams, no more surprise lawsuit. It was finally over. Or so I thought. A month later, I got a call from my brother, Mark, who lived 2 towns over. "Hey," he said, barely containing his laughter. "You're not gonna believe this." "What? Guess who just moved into my neighborhood?" I froze. "No, oh yeah," he confirmed. "She's already tried to fine me for having my trash cans out too early." I sat down, shaking my head, a slow grin spreading across my face. "Mark," I said, "I think I have some advice on how to handle this.